Well, thanks. I appreciate the invitation, and it's nice to see lots of familiar names in the room today. Thank you all for joining. As Liz mentioned, this is mostly research that's coming out of the time I spent as a research ecologist with the USGS based there in Santa Fe, New Mexico in the Southwest. So I've been fortunate to work with a number of excellent colleagues in the Southwest on a lot of the work that I'm going to be sharing here. And I just wanted to acknowledge that up front and to point out that a lot of the content here, the majority of it, in fact, is contained in this paper that was published recently in Forest Ecology and Management. There's a QR code there that you can scan if you want to get to the link, and I think we'll drop that in the chat later today as well. I also wanted to say that there's been a really an increasing amount of interest on this topic in the last several years, and that has really manifested with a timely series of publications, a number of which were published in this special issue linked to in the lower left there on integrating wildfire into forest landscape management. This is a issue that Andrew Larson was the guest editor for in Forest Ecology and Management. And so this paper was in there, as well as a paper in the lower right there that was focused on the inland Pacific Northwest. And there was also a U.S. Forest Service research publication that came out the same year, last year, focused on national forest restoration in California. And that's Mark Meyer's group. So these three publications are tailored somewhat specifically to the regions of focus, but there are a lot of emergent themes that are pretty similar across them. So I would encourage anyone who's interested in this topic to dig into all of that literature because it's quite complementary. So for this particular talk, the observation that really motivated this work is the data shown here, which displays the proportion of federally managed forests that has burned within the past 10 years as a function of time. And you can see that that's pretty monotonically increasing to the point where in 2020, around 12% of federally managed forest in that four-state region there, Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, and Utah, was burned within the past 10 years. And the trends on non-federally managed lands are similar. That's compared to around 1% in 1993. So clearly the landscape template that forest managers are facing today has a lot more recent fire on it than it may have in the past. You can see that breakdown by state in the lower right portion of this figure. And Arizona in 2020 had around 23% of its federally managed forests burned within the past 10 years. So this is important for a number of reasons. Really, broadly speaking, the template for forest management at a landscape scale is really changing, and it's changing quickly. And we need to think strategically about how past wildfire effects can be incorporated into decisions that we're making to sustain our forests into the future. So just to give one example of this with some data that we pulled together for this publication, this figure here shows the area burned at high severity as a function of year in the southern Rocky Mountains. So this is Colorado and northern New Mexico. And you can see that on the scale there on the left, there's been quite an increase in the incidence of fires that are fire seasons rather that have 100,000 acres or more of high severity. So that represents sort of an upper bound on the area that we might consider warranting reforestation. You can see in contrast that the area that has received reforestation has remained quite low and is often an order of magnitude less than the upper bounds of what might be required under the high severity fire effects that we're seeing in conifer forests in this region over the past decade and a half, say. So really the pace of management here is not keeping up with the scale of burned areas in this particular instance, and there are other instances of that as well. So there are a number of challenges that are facing post-fire management. There's been a plethora of research in the last 4 to 5 years on reburn dynamics. This is not a surprise as we continue to see area burned increase. We're seeing more and more instances of 2 or even 3 reburns within a relatively short period of time. This is also expected given we know these are frequent fire climates and frequent fire forests, but what this literature is really suggesting with some pretty strong evidence is that reburns can enforce initial patterns of fire severity in particular. And whether or not a reburn occurs, that there's a significant risk of, or maybe not risk, but a significant likelihood of alternative vegetation states developing after high severity fire. This is due to a confluence of factors, perhaps most importantly, the influence of dispersal limitation on conifer regeneration. These are not serotinous species for the most part, and so any establishment of new conifers needs to come from surviving adult mature populations. And then the effects of climate change laid on top of that mean that the conditions that seedlings are facing are increasingly hot and dry. So the likelihood of reestablishing conifer forest in large high severity patches in particular is quite low. Another challenge is that there are limited resources and infrastructure for reforestation beyond generally the immediate 1 to 2 year post-fire response. That's often governed by the burned area emergency rehabilitation process, which largely is oriented towards slope stabilization, hydrological risk mitigation, and other short-term responses. There's often less resources and support given to longer-term vegetation management. And then, of course, we have lots of examples of quite warranted focus on unburned forest restoration, and this will continue, but as that graph in the beginning of this talk showed, the area burned is increasing pretty steadily. And so we need to find a way to balance our priorities in unburned landscapes with the increasing patchwork of recently burned forest in the Southwest. So we came up with one approach to try to think strategically through how to work in burned landscapes. This is just one approach, but I would again highlight that there are quite a few similarities with our framework and the work that was developed both in California and in the interior Northwest. Chief among those for all three publications, including this one, is that we're really suggesting a landscape perspective on this. And so the first step in our framework is to partition the post-fire landscape based on an evaluation of surviving forest. In this case, that largely rests on an evaluation of burn severity. So in this example, and in this paper, we suggest partitioning that considers both where you have post-fire forest patches and where you have post-fire treeless patches, which is more or less analogous to high severity. And then we partition those two classes of patches, forested and treeless, into large and small size classes. And then arguably a fifth landscape condition would be represented by young stands, whether those are naturally regenerating or planted. The second phase of this process is to evaluate trajectories of change for vegetation in the class of interest, the landscape class of interest. And so factors that go into this process include what the landscape condition is, ecosystem process models, the time frame of interest, the likelihood of future disturbance, and then importantly, social and political and cultural values. And all of those factors can go into an evaluation of future vegetation trajectory that can consider likely future vegetation states as either desirable or undesirable. That's the role that values play in all of this. And then the models can inform the likelihood of those respective outcomes. And it's not just a binary process. This could be multi-dimensional, but easier to represent this way. And we found it was pretty useful to put this in the context of the resist, accept, direct, or RAD framework that's gained increasing popularity among the land management community. And so in this case, if you identify a future vegetation trajectory as desirable, you might accept that and take no action. And if it's undesirable, you may choose to resist further change, or if the change has already happened that is undesirable, you may choose to direct it toward a more desirable condition with some intervention. And so then where the rubber meets the road is this phase 3, where we prioritize, implement, and monitor critically. So this is a general framework, so you would pick your relevant processes of interest to the vegetation condition that you're looking at, but common conditions and common processes to consider would include stand structure, fuels, regeneration of vegetation, soils and hydrology. There could be a host of other process considerations. And then all of that information would feed into a prioritization process, which occurs both spatially and temporally. So questions around when and where to intervene. There's a host of spatial and temporal vegetation models that can be useful to conduct this prioritization. I'll show you a few examples of that later on in this talk. And then when it comes to implementation, again, the specifics will need to be tailored to the conditions on the ground, but a few guiding principles that we suggest that are, again, largely mirrored in the work from other regions is to diversify the portfolio of actions. In other words, especially where there's uncertainty, it makes sense to try multiple things and to track the outcomes of the portfolio of actions that you're implementing. New techniques can be useful, especially under changing climate and increasing fire frequency. We need to consider how those things will likely impact the actions that we take on the ground. It's really important to have infrastructure to support this work. Nursery capacity is one specific example, but there are a whole host of infrastructure steps to accomplishing things on the ground that need to be that may need to be scaled up in order to get the work done to match the scale of the need. And then it's important to make linkages across scales as well. So actions that we take locally should be considered in that landscape context. And for example, when it comes to planting trees or managing fuels or implementing future prescribed fire projects, think about how those local actions fit into that broader landscape context. And then you have to close the loop with monitoring and adaptive management. That's critical. And it always comes at the end when you describe these things, but I would say it's arguably the most important part. So here are a few examples of how this concept has been applied in the Southwest in some ways that it all fits together. So you'll see me reference this fire a number of times in this talk, but this is a fire that I worked on very closely when I was there in Santa Fe, the Las Conchas fire. Most folks on this call likely know this very well. But that's occurred in the eastern flank of the Jemez Mountains, and it overlapped a number of prior burns to the extent where the vast majority of that fire footprint, when you integrate all of the previous fire effects, is in a treeless condition. And so we did that landscape partitioning on the Las Conchas fire, and you can see here that you've got the large treeless patches represented in dark red. Small treeless patches are then necessarily embedded within larger forest patches, and then you have small forest patches, that light blue color, which you can think of as refugia, and I'll talk about those a bit more. We used 100-hectare cutoff between small and large, and that's inevitably going to be a bit arbitrary, but we think that's a reasonable approximation for what the upper end of historical high severity patch sizes would have been in frequent fire forest. In other words, when you have fire occurring that frequently, the scale of fuel buildup that will support contiguous high severity effects is fairly limited. And so that next step in the process, which is to evaluate trajectories of change, I find this diagram that Jonathan Koop, who's a co-author on this paper, and a number of other co-authors from this paper had put together in a 2020 bioscience paper, to be really useful in thinking about the role of time in ecosystem change. And before I jump ahead here, just the concept here is that after you have a fire, you may have conditions that didn't change a whole lot, and so your resistance, that initial resistance, may still be intact, and so the ecological distance, in other words, the degree of change from before and after the fire event, is relatively low, and that continues into the future. You may have a condition where things change quite a bit, but are able to rebound towards that initial condition, in this case, conifer forest, within, say, a lifetime, and that might be an operational definition of resilience. And then in the instances where you have a high degree of change and very slow movement or no movement at all, and at least over our time of perception towards that initial condition, that might represent a type conversion. And so three sort of case studies within our framework that I'll present on here sort of fit neatly into this framework. So I'll talk in reverse order about large treeless patches, which might in the RAD framework represent a condition where we want to direct vegetation. Small treeless patches, which represent a condition where we might accept conditions as they are, and then small forest patches, which might represent conditions where we want to resist further change. In other words, things didn't change that much from before to after the fire, but there may be some vulnerability for future change in those areas that we want to take action to prevent. So as I said, in reverse order, I've talked about small forest patches. We're defining those operationally here as basically any patch of surviving forest, including and down to a single tree, like you can see in this photograph from the pumpkin fire in Arizona. There's been a lot of really excellent work on the importance of small forest patches in the context of ecological refugia. There's a rich literature that's developing on that. But one of the things that's emerging from that is that post-fire refugia are critically important as natural seed sources for conifer regeneration. And a second piece that's emerging from that is that refugia can be particularly vulnerable to reburns. This is an example in the photograph here of a patch of forest that survived an initial fire in 1996 within the footprint of the Las Conchas fire. And then that entire refugium was killed was killed in the Las Conchas fire. And so that photograph on the right is a post-fire photo. There's additional vulnerability to wind events. This photograph on the lower right represents or is an example of a blowdown event that occurred within a refugia that had maybe a dozen or so surviving trees, and around half of those came down in this high wind event that was in, I believe, the spring of 2019 in the Las Conchas fire. And you can see in that photograph on the lower right that there's also, even independent of that blowdown event, there's considerable coarse woody debris and shrubs representing fuel within the understory of that refugium. So one potential action for consideration in refugia, if the goal is to retain some degree of resilience to future fires, would be to do some fuels management to reduce vulnerability to future fire. In other words, deal with the surface fuel problem. And I'll talk a little bit in just a minute about one approach to doing that, but I'll talk about that in the context of the second case study, which are small treeless patches. And in general, I think our group of authors at least thinks about these as consistent within the natural range of variability, and generally that would indicate that natural regeneration would be sufficient in these patches to the point where tree planting would be unnecessary, unless there are other overriding considerations that would warrant an accelerated return to forest. But in most cases, natural regeneration in these patches should be sufficient to get you where you want to go. And furthermore, repeated fire within smaller treeless patches may, as I mentioned earlier, reinforce those initial high severity effects and retain some early cereal habitat that might be valuable for wildlife habitat or other reasons. But one concern with small treeless patches that's reflected in this example here is that those fuel conditions on the edge may present a vulnerability to the surrounding live forest. In other words, reburns may increase the patch size of small treeless patches due to heavy fuels at the margins. And this is demonstrated in this example from Grand Canyon National Park. Chris Marks was instrumental in pulling this work together. It was really his team, the prescribed fire team at Grand Canyon, that implemented this work. But you can see in the fire shown in the yellow there, or I guess rather the fire in the red in the northern portion of this footprint, there were some smaller high severity patches following a fire in 2001. The text is a bit small there, but that red fire was in 2001, and then the yellow fire was in 2009 and enlarged several of those smaller patches and burned high severity into the surrounding forest. And Chris and his team recognized this and saw the potential for future fires to continue to enlarge those. And their objective for this patch of ground was to retain those patches at a relatively small size and try to restore or promote resilience in the surrounding forest so that it didn't eventually, with a series of reburns, continue to shift towards high severity effects. And so the approach that they used is a concept that in this paper we referred to as edge hardening. This was a targeted direct ignition of the heavy fuels that came down following that 2001 fire. And Chris would be able to provide information on the specific prescription that was used, but if I recall correctly, it was a November burn window with fairly low or with fairly high humidity, but a fairly long period without precipitation previously. So the fuel moistures were fairly low. And they did direct log ignitions. And you can see an example. It's not the same spot on the photograph, but comparing the upper right to the upper left. So they really did quite a bit of fuels reduction in the understory, dealing with the heavy fuels without causing much, if any, damage to the overstory surviving trees. So this concept of edge hardening could be theoretically implemented not only to sustain a smaller patch size for high severity fire effects, but also to try to conserve refugia, especially in areas where they're isolated and they are among the only live trees in any direction for miles or more. So the final case study to think about here, and there's probably much more that could be said on this topic than would fit into this talk, but just to kind of put it into the landscape context framework, there's a lot of interest in large treeless patches. This is an area, again, as I mentioned, where there's some pretty good research on the likelihood of these retaining versus remaining in an alternative stable state especially in ponderosa pine and dry mix conifer systems. It's a different story, obviously, where you have hardwoods present or where you have serotinous species like lodgepole pine present. But the literature on seed dispersal distances is pretty consistent in terms of the rarity of seed dispersal events of ponderosa pine in particular beyond 100 to 250 meters. Not to say that occasional long distance dispersal events aren't possible, but likely not at the scale that would be needed to more or less restock a stand, at least within, say, 50 to 100 years. So given that, this would be an opportunity where reforestation could be considered. And one of the guiding principles for this work, again, is to consider how actions around reforestation are likely to hold up in the context of future fires. So the sort of traditional approach to plantations over a large area would be to do more or less even spacing, and then do some subsequent vegetation management or thinning to get the stand density to where it would be historically. An alternative approach, especially when large areas are impacted by higher severity fire, is the concept of nucleation planting. And this is new enough that it's often still being implemented experimentally. So we don't have great data on how this is likely to develop over time. But in principle, the idea here is to establish founder stands in a dispersed pattern across the landscape. And what this does is two things. Number one, it provides potential seed source for future cohorts, provided that those initial founder stands can reach reproductive maturity. And one threat to that would be future fire impacting those stands. And so the second advantage of this approach is that you're basically spatially hedging your bets across the landscape, and you're putting founder stands at sufficient distance from each other where, not if, but when that future fire happens, yeah, you may lose a few founder stands due to conditions on a given day, but you've got others elsewhere in the landscape, and that fire might lie down at night, and when it gets to the next founder stand, maybe it just creeps through it, or maybe it misses it entirely. So that sort of spatial bet hedging, combined with the fact that we're letting these founder stands fill in the rest of the landscape for us. And then the third advantage would be that it mimics what we think are natural regeneration patterns in drier mixed conifer systems, which tend to be clustered in the small scale sense, an acre or less regeneration patches, and then those can sort of develop at that scale. So this, again, is an experimental approach, but regardless, there are some considerations for reforestation that would apply to any spatial planning approach, and those would be the importance of, I'm just going to pause there for a second. The importance of anticipating future climate change on seedling resilience. And so there's some interesting work going on drought conditioning seedlings that New Mexico State is working on. Their already fairly common practice is to use nurse objects as shade structures. There is interest and not a ton of data at this point on how a future fire might impact seedling survival, given that nurse objects are often coarse woody debris that would likely burn hot if they were to catch fire. So there may be a sort of a time window during which, if you're using a nurse object approach, you need to keep fire out so that the trees that are growing up next to those nurse objects can reach a size where they're resistant to the next fire. And then a broader note is that there's a really massive seed collection need. There's not only a massive seed collection need, but there's a real need to invest in the infrastructure of nurseries to boost capacity to produce seedlings. And a lot of those points are highlighted in that recent paper there by Joe Fargione et al. So I won't go into the details on that, but there's certainly a need to bolster our infrastructure around reforestation. So, as I mentioned, we worked a lot in the lost conscious footprint. This fire has gotten a lot of attention by a lot of really excellent scientists, and so we had a lot of good material to draw on here. And a group of scientists and managers was pretty active in pulling together a number of these concepts into a strategy for both reforestation and fuels management. So the landscape here really describes the reforestation strategy that spanned Santa Clara Pueblo, Bandelier National Monument, and the Jemez Ranger District on the Santa Fe National Forest. And the broad strategy, again, was to target planting areas at least 120 meters from a live forest edge. And then we took it a step further, and we brought in some climate model predictions that my colleague Kyle Rodman was instrumental in developing based on a pretty robust field data set collected across the Southern Rocky Mountains that predicted the probability of, in this case, natural regeneration success, the probability of finding naturally regenerating seedlings, given that there was a seed source available under a wide range of climate and topographic conditions, and then the ability to forecast that into future climate space as well. So we used these models to basically show how the likelihood of regeneration success varied across the footprint of this landscape. And that's what that color map that ranges from yellow, which is a low likelihood of regeneration, to blue, which is a higher likelihood of regeneration for ponderosa pine. We use those climatic models to try to target our planting units into areas where climate was likely to be suitable for ponderosa pine and Douglas fir over the next 100 years. You can see that we did adopt the nucleation planting approach, and we did a range of densities based on local conditions and seed availability at the time of planting. The planting units are shown there in purple, and so you can see we didn't cover the entire landscape. There were some significant access issues, and even within those planting units, we were constrained by access, by archaeological clearances, by topography, and by local conditions. So this was sort of a planning process map, and the final location of these points moved around quite a bit from where we initially put them. But you can still see that there's coverage across the landscape there. And so we're really trying to bring that spatial bet hedging approach to bear in this work. The fuel strategy is developing at the same time, and really what we are, the guiding principle here is, again, the need to protect the surviving refugia from future fires. And so the three arrows there are just examples of what in this footprint are some of the most important refugia. Those are relatively small, a few acres in size, and they're kind of the only show in town. There aren't many live trees within, you can see around a kilometer of those refugia. But some of the larger refugia in the northern part of that map that span into Bandelier National Monument are also under consideration for some fuels management at the edge as well. So this work is continuing, and as was noted at the top of the presentation, I'm no longer with USGS, but I'm really happy to get updates on the planting work that folks are doing there. From 2020 to 2021, a group that is sponsored by or operating under the auspices of the East Jemez Landscape Futures, which is a landscape collaborative focused on post-fire management in the Eastern Jemez Mountains, was able to plant around 40,000 seedlings, and that work is going to continue next year as well. And then an additional effort on the Jemez and Santo Domingo Pueblos. I think this number here just refers to the planting on the Jemez Pueblo in particular. That work was supported by Trees, Water, and People and the Tri-Pueblo Coalition. The East Jemez work was supported by the Wildlife Conservation Society. So all told, that's over 50,000 seedlings in the last 2 years in those landscapes, using, again, this nucleation approach. And we're working right now on a monitoring strategy for that to try to figure out, what are the developments of these cluster plantings looking like over the next 3 to 5 years, and hopefully much beyond that. There's one other example that I wanted to highlight here at the end, and then I welcome opening it up to discussion. And that is that Region 5 and the Forest Service is piloting a project this year where they're working to stand up these post-fire rapid assessments. These are targeted at several fires that burned in 2021. And the objective is to develop a rapid assessment to evaluate long-term resource needs. So this is thinking beyond the timeline of the Bayer process. And it fits quite nicely with the sort of the concepts that I presented here, as well as that GTR that I referenced earlier that came out of California and the Pacific Southwest Research Station. And so I was able to sit on one of these teams for the Sequoia National Forest, and basically bring this same approach to bear there, and helping the forest think about longer term planning for 4 fires that burned across that national forest in 2021. And so you can see it's basically the same color scheme there in that map that I showed earlier for the Las Conchas. And in this case, we're thinking about the landscape classes as being defined by sort of the operational needs. And so reforestation patches are identified there in red. gaps are identified in yellow, refugia in light blue, and then what we're thinking about is resilience zones in dark blue. So these would be zones where prescribed fire would be an option. There's, just as a brief digression, there's been a lot of, again, really excellent work thinking about what is the actual restoration work that is done by low to moderate severity effects of fire. And it's hard to generalize broadly across that, but I would say that the most important piece that's emerging from that is, well, you still have canopy cover intact, and you probably still have some trees of a fire resistant size in there, and there was probably some significant surface fuel reduction. And where the effects can vary is was it low or was it moderate? How much standing dead is there within those areas? How much of that is likely to transition to surface fuels over time? And so it can still be challenging to make decisions around operationalizing prescribed fire in those zones. But certainly with the presence of a surviving conifer canopy, those are areas that would make sense to target for future prescribed fire or future managed wildfire, to really think about using these burn landscapes as anchor points to try to stitch together portions of the landscape where that wildfire did some of that initial fuels reduction work for us. So we ended up also incorporating some climate modeling that was coming out of UC Davis on the reforestation piece. And so we did a prioritization of our reforestation areas there. So this sort of final product map is just focusing on conifer forest areas in this particular fire footprint. This is the French fire, but there are some high priority refugia located within the middle of that large high severity patch. There are some potential resilience zones located on the northern and southern edges of the fire. As you can see, that this is kind of a similar approach here that the forest can then use to think about their longer term planning goals for these burn landscapes and how they fit together. So I'm going to stop there and hopefully just summarize a few of the themes that have emerged from this review that may be useful as folks think about applying these principles on your own landscapes or in your own collaboratives. And that is, I think, really first and foremost, it's important to take a spatially explicit approach. It's important to consider local actions in a landscape context. What are the conditions that may be overrepresented or underrepresented on the landscape, and how does that compare to desired conditions? Secondly is an important focus on prioritization. So it's going to be rare that we have the resources, all the resources that we might like to be able to do everything that we might like to do. And so there's inevitably going to be some trade-offs involved in working in location A versus location B, at least to start. But if we can bring some science to bear in that prioritization process, it gives us at least a little bit of a basis to say, we think our action in this area is going to produce the greatest return. And so we're going to start to work here first. And it's never going to be a perfect process, and we're always going to be learning from that. But I think that's a good starting point. Again, another guiding principle is to diversify the portfolio of actions. If we try different things, then we're able to learn from those things that we try. A fourth guiding principle would be to work towards fine-grained heterogeneity, or fine-grained variability in structure and fuels. Keeping that variability both helps to mitigate future fire effects, and it also mirrors what we think was an emergent characteristic of frequent fire forests in the past. And then finally, as I've mentioned a couple of times, it's really critical to monitor and to learn, to take sort of a humble approach to these questions, recognize that we don't know everything, but if we pay attention to what we're doing and we operate in an adaptive management context, then that knowledge can carry forth and continue to inform our decision making. So just wanted to recognize again, I think a lot of people, hopefully a lot of people on this call are thinking about these issues on their own landscape. And I just want to recognize that it's challenging work. We can use models and then someone still has to go out there and put the trees in the ground or buck up the fuels or light the prescribed fire. And so, recognizing that this is aspirational and at some point it bumps up against reality, but I think there's a real opportunity here to have folks work together to get this work done, because I think the need for it is only going to increase. So I really appreciate all the work that folks on this call are doing in these areas, and look forward to continued conversations with folks on these topics. Wanted to give a shout out to collaborators on this work. It's certainly not everybody who's played a role. That's mostly the list of co-authors on the paper, but I really benefited from a lot of great conversations with folks there on the ground while I was in New Mexico, and pretty pleased with the work y'all are doing. So Liz, I think with that, I will wrap it up and kick it back to you. I have not been monitoring the chat if there has been anything showing up there, but I'll stop. Maybe I'll stop sharing my screen, but I can pull that back up if I need to reference anything here.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, gents. That was a great presentation, really interesting and important work that you're touching on here. I'll remind everyone that you can either raise your hand, or if you have a question, you can put it in the chat while people are kind of collecting their thoughts and mulling over what we just heard. I'll kick it off with a question. Gents, how does it seem like that this paper has been received by land managers? Are people willing to take up these approaches? Are they excited about it? What's just your general perception?
Yeah, not just this one, but I think that those other two papers that I highlighted at the top, Mark Meyer's paper and Andrew Larson's paper, I think there's certainly interest in it. I can speak just from the experience working on that Sequoia post-fire rapid assessment group that I think having those papers has been useful for folks to think through the processes. They are, I think, necessarily broad in principle, and hopefully they leave space for more local considerations to be brought in. But I don't know. I'd be interested to hear how folks receive this, if they've used it at all, and always looking for feedback on how to make stuff more relevant. So I think it's been positive, but I'm biased.
Okay, I got a direct message request. Could you speak a little more about where managers are getting their spatial data for the Forest Service developed post-fire rapid assessments?
Yeah, the spatial data is mostly been pulled together for that by Region 5. So, there's a whole black box network drive where that data sits, and that's available for planners to use for a whole host of purposes. I can just speak to the specific, since I was just working on that Sequoia assessment, we had information on Sequoia grove locations, Pacific fisher habitat, a couple other key resource considerations that was spatial. And then I guess the other thing I would add on to that is, there's been a real proliferation of sort of web tools that are coming out, specifically around the reforestation piece. I know that, so I referenced Kyle Rodman's model. Kyle's with ERI now in Flagstaff, but he has a web tool that can basically generate that likely reforestation success kind of model for any area within the Southern Rocky Mountains. There are similar products being developed in California. I mentioned the piece I used for the Sequoia assessment came out of UC Davis. That's work that Derek Young is working on. Joe Stewart has pulled together a tool called Postscript for California that operates similarly. And they're basically using that burn severity information. They're sort of cutting out the middle person in that step, which is to go from burn severity to predicted natural regeneration probability. So that tool in particular, the Postscript tool I just referenced, is able to do that for California. I'm not aware of any tools that do that specifically for the Northern Rockies or the interior Northwest. I do know that there's work going on led by the Nature Conservancy and Kim Davis at the University of Montana to sort of develop a Western regional model of likely natural regeneration potential post-fire. That work is pretty early stage, so I don't know when that's going to be available. But so it's a bit idiosyncratic, I guess, is the short answer. But certainly, the national forests have quite a bit of spatial data already that could be brought to bear if working on those lands. I know that Bandelier similarly had data, and then that landscape approach is really critical for, take that back. The landscape approach really relies on remote sensing data. So burn severity products, ravage products, the rapid assessment of vegetation. I don't know if that's specifically a Region 5 thing or if Region 3 has that as well, but there are a number of burn severity products out there that can be used for this sort of work that do a pretty good job at approximating where you have post-fire forest cover and where you don't, with some caveats.
Okay, and Travis, Wooly notes that the Kim Davis work is wrapping up and she is working to submit a manuscript soon. So that's exciting.
Thanks, Travis.
Tim Kirkpatrick asks, what are the cost acre differences in treatment methods that you analyzed?
Thanks, Tim. I wish I had a good answer for you on that. that is a bit outside of my realm of expertise, although if there are folks on the call who have ballpark numbers, I'd welcome you to drop those in the chat. Yeah, I don't have those numbers handy. I think, yeah, I don't want to speculate. I can just, the one thing I maybe would be comfortable speculating to say is that the reforestation work, it is the nucleation strategy of reforestation is motivated primarily by how do we get trees in to diffuse parts of the landscape rather than necessarily just the most accessible. How do we get them into the areas that maybe need it the most? And we made those decisions, sitting in front of a computer with a map of a road network there in the East Tamas that was moderately accurate, I'll say. But then when it came time to actually getting out to those locations, there was a lot of alterations that needed to be made on the fly, and that inevitably adds to the cost because it adds to the time spent and it adds to sort of the time deliberating versus planting out in the field. So, the trade-off there would be, are we hopefully by doing some of the legwork ahead of time to identify climatically suitable zones and areas where, if we're successful in reforesting, we're likely to multiply our benefit multiple times in the future due to that natural regeneration diffusing out from the nucleation sites, that would justify potentially higher costs in travel time, in crew time that would be associated with that. But it's too soon to do a real rigorous cost analysis on that. And I don't have the cost per acre on that because that was handled by a different team, but I appreciate the question.
Okay, Andy Stevenson, I'm going to ask you to unmute so you can answer ask your question.
So Jens, I just really want to say I really appreciated all the stuff that you brought up. I really feel like you hit the nail on the head. These are all issues that I've dealt with. I'm sorry, I'm a silviculturist on the Flagstaff Ranger District on the Coconino National Forest. And so one of the things I really wanted to ask you about is, so we have these large burn scars and we have those, refugia that exist out there. And, when my fire managers have been doing prescribed burns, they've been taking those out. And I've been trying to push back on them. And it feels like planting puts me in direct conflict with a lot of my fire folks, because if I plant after a fire, oftentimes we don't have the ability to do any salvage logging. So we have fuels on the ground. We planted it and they're looking for acres to burn. And I'm telling them, you can't touch that for at least 20 years, probably longer. And then some of these old fires that they are burning, where I haven't planted yet, they are taking out these islands of refugia. And I've asked them about ideas of, hey, let's, buck up these logs and take them out around the edge or do the special burning. And I'm just wondering, what's been your experience when you talked with other fuel managers out there about hardening the edges of these refugia? Because that sounds like a very big ask to me.
Yeah, well, I guess the optimist in me would say we have examples of it working. I highlighted that Grand Canyon example, and I know that might be hard to replicate on a larger scale, but I think that's an example of a success story that could be replicated. And it involves fire, so maybe that would make the fuels folks happy. The question around needing to meet acres burned targets, shall we say, it's a complicated one. And I think my have your cake and eat it too kind of approach would be, if we're looking to get acres done, can we identify areas on the landscape where we had larger, more or less contiguous, low severity effects, where the fire did some of that initial surface fuel reduction for us, and we're likely to have, a renewal of a litter fuel bed from the surviving conifers, probably some additional heavy fuels coming down as the snags fall, depending on whether it was low or moderate severity, probably a relatively moderate to mild shrub response. And so, you could probably get a pretty complex fuel bed that could be manageable to get those acres and actually count those acres as, basically reinforcing a treatment, so to speak. So think about that initial wildfire, those low severity portions of an initial wildfire, as a treatment that you don't have to go out and do now because the fire did it for you. And some of the places where that likely happened are maybe inaccessible, steep terrain, wilderness, places where you might not have gone in to do a treatment anyway. But that's still, that's work that can be done and can be counted as beneficial acres. But I would wager that a lot of those areas are still, there's going to still be a fuel accumulation issue that'll need to be dealt with. And I don't know, it doesn't make sense to me to try to get acres by reburning a high severity patch. If, as you say, it could be in conflict with our, silvicultural or forest restoration objectives. If the goal is to get trees back onto the landscape, then I mean, I hear you. Let's not take the trees that survived that first fire out if we can avoid it. I think you, and I don't want to ramble on here, but I'm not seeing anything, so I'm happy to keep going in the chat. But the refugia piece. So ask the question: can we, quote unquote, get acres out of the larger patches of low severity? What I identified in that last slide from the Sequoia as the sort of resilience zones. That would be the place I would want to focus, because I think you can get larger contiguous blocks, and maybe you don't have to do as much on the inside of those. You just have to work around the edges, make sure that your lines are secure, and then you can burn within them, say, 5 to 7 years after that fire. The refugia piece is harder because often the most valuable refugia from a potential future reforestation perspective are those that are the smallest and the most isolated. And so there could be there probably is a cost trade-off between, sending a crew out there to buck up logs to protect that one tree from the pumpkin fire that I showed. That was a photograph in one of my earlier slides. But I guess I would say if you're gonna burn those anyway, if your plan is to reburn a high severity area and there's an opportunity to do some prep work, it makes sense to go out there and do it. And the last thing I'll say, and I can't speak to the details of how well this is working, and if there's anyone from Bandelier on the call right now, that the Park Service, Bandelier National Monument in particular, is trying to factor this consideration around refugia protection into some of their fuels management plans. And I don't think their plan is to do a direct log ignition like what was done at Grand Canyon. I think it does involve a bit more of sort of a mechanical, pile and hopefully eventually burn. They've done a lot of roadside pile and burns there, do a fall or winter burn, say a year or two out. And I think that's another example of where, this work is being used to say, okay, well, let's take some steps that we need to conserve these refugia, even though, they're relatively small. They're important from that landscape perspective. So, I realized I just gave you maybe two national parks examples for how it's worked successfully, but I think, there's a real opportunity there to if there's the will, then I think we have the tools to do it. Appreciate the question, Andy.
Okay, does anyone else have any questions? Anything that they want gents to elaborate on before we go? We have a few minutes left still. Okay.
I appreciate so folks saw, because I just saw it after I stopped sharing my screen, that Xander put the links to that paper in the chat, the link to that paper in the chat, and some other resources as well. So thank you, Xander.
Okay, well, if there's no more questions, we'll let you all go. Thank you again so much, gents. That was a really informative presentation. And yeah, have a good rest of your afternoon, everybody.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it, everybody. Good to see y'all.